guys, and welcome to today's video where I'm going to go through 10 things you should know or at least think about before getting any reptile. I hope this sets you on the right path. As someone who has owned reptiles now for almost 2 decades, I know it can be daunting when you first get into them. There's a lot of information to take on. So I hope these 10 points make you think and make sure you can check them off your list of things you have thought about or researched. So number 1, food. What does the animal you want need to eat? Will you have to keep like mice and rats and chicks in your freezer? Or will you need to keep feeding insects and keep them alive? And as I mentioned in a previous video, I went into owning a pink tongue skink hoping that I would just have to give him frozen thawed snails, but knowing that there's a chance I'd have to feed him live ones. And actually now I have 6 to 7 large tubs of snails for this one skink. So make sure you are aware of your animal's whole diet, what you might need to keep in your house and potentially in your freezer. Number 2, how long does a reptile live? Now obviously this can vary from reptile to reptile and a long life isn't always guaranteed. We also can't predict the future or what our circumstances are going to be in 10, 15, 20 years, and taking on that responsibility can be daunting. But reptiles generally can live a long time, so are you prepared to take that on? I'd say if you're unsure right now, just wait a little bit, maybe 6 months, a year down the line. If you still really want that lizard, then maybe it's the right decision. I know for me, I really wanted a leopard gecko when I was 10, and I had to wait 3 years before I could get one. So for a child to want something for 3 years straight, you kind of know that they're pretty stuck on it, and here we are like 18 years later. If you are planning on going to university or college, you know, in a few years' time, who's going to look after the reptiles then? Are you going to have to rehome them? Are you going to have to give them to a family member or a friend to take them on for a few years? So these are certainly things you need to think about. Number 3, supplements. Now you'll be surprised how many people go into reptile keeping unaware that supplements are needed on their animal's food. Now I think if you've always been a snake keeper or you're looking at a snake, I believe most snakes, and I'm not a snake person, but I think most snakes get a lot of their vitamins and minerals from the whole prey and a UV lamp, so it's not as important. But for a lot of them, for example my leopard geckos and stuff, it is so important to supplement their food, and not just with calcium or calcium and D3, but an array of vitamins and minerals. I actually have a video covering what each of them do, why they're important, and I just can't stress enough. I know it sounds like a boring topic, but please look into supplements. I've done many videos on them before. There are a range of brands that make supplements for reptiles. Personally, I use the Earth Pro range, and I have a whole supplementing enlightened schedule for my leopard geckos. That whole video I will link below because that should set you on the right path. Number 4, expenses. Now, setups can be expensive, often more expensive than the animal itself, but sometimes you can get like secondhand tanks or a good deal at a shop. But once you have that animal, there will always be ongoing costs, like electricity, for example, or their food. Now, compared to some animals I've kept, guinea pigs, dogs, they're not too expensive. It really depends how many you have. But every 2 weeks or once a month, I have to buy more food for my reptiles. Then comes in vet bills. Now, it really ranges, right? Because sometimes you can have a very hardy animal that rarely ever gets sick, rarely ever needs to see a vet. You could end up with a sickly animal or an animal that was very sensitive and can go downhill. Or if you haven't set something up correctly, for example, if you haven't been providing supplements, or the animal gets injured for some reason, or there's just another issue, you would likely have to see a vet. Now, sadly, over my many years of doing this, I have heard from quite a few people panicking. They've got this sick animal, they want me to resolve the issue despite being the other side of the world and having no qualifications to do so, and when I suggest they see a vet, they say they can't afford it. And I get that money is tight at the moment, but pets aren't a necessity. Nobody's forcing you to get a pet, right? And if you're barely able to buy their setup or buy their food, then what are you going to do when they need a vet? Because I feel like as responsible keepers, if you take on any pet, if they're in medical need, you have to see a vet. And it does bug me sometimes when someone says, I can't afford a thermostat or I can't afford a hide, because then it's like, okay, what are you going to do when it comes to a vet? Because they aren't that cheap. So what you could do is put aside some money a little bit now and again, and you have that emergency fund for your reptile, or you can even get pet insurance. Number 5, speaking of vets, do you have an exotics vet or a veterinary surgery that accepts exotics nearby? Now, to be honest, because I live in the UK, it's very small, things are very close by, there are tons of vets near me, right? But I know from talking to people from America and Canada, things can be really spread out depending on where you live. So this might be something you have to research on your own, but before you even buy that animal, you should probably know how far you'd have to travel and how much it would cost, because the last thing you want to be doing is panicking because your animal is sick and then you just can't do anything about it. Number 6, using UV. So most reptiles will benefit from being exposed to UVB and UVA. This could be a whole video on its own. I'm sure I've probably covered it before. I do have a whole reptile heating and lighting playlist if you want to check it out. However, I think it's important to mention that if you use the wrong type of or the wrong strength of UV lamp, or you install it incorrectly, it can be incredibly dangerous. So it's really important to do your research and figure out what is a brand and a type of UV lamp that many other fellow keepers use and trust for that specific animal. And you can find this out on forums, Facebook, YouTube, and you can always cross-reference that information that you find, and you might start to notice, actually, like, all these panther chameleon keepers keep this type of UV lamp and this strength, and that will give me the UV index of this if it's at the correct distance. I mean, look, there's a bit of a science to it, but for me, for the leopard geckos, I use a 7% shade dweller and a 2.5% shade dweller arboreal for my crested gecko. So if anyone was wondering, that is that. Number 7, heating and thermostats. Similar to UV, heating is obviously very beneficial to our animals, but their need can vary drastically. My crested gecko could suffer from heat stroke at a continual temperature above 28 degrees Celsius. But my leopard geckos, they need a basking area of 30 to 32 degrees Celsius, otherwise they'd be too cold and wouldn't be able to function correctly. So it's not one size fits all, bung a bulb in there and they're all going to be fine. So I can't stress this enough, but whatever form of heating you choose to use, whether that's a heat mat, ceramic heat emitter, deep heat projector, halogen, flood lamp, spot lamp, whatever it is, make sure it's plugged into and controlled by a thermostat to ensure your reptile's basking area temperature is correct. Number 8, understand what environment you're trying to mimic. Is your reptile arboreal or terrestrial? Would a tall tank or a low and wide tank be better? Do they come from an arid region or tropical rainforests? A good example of this is blue-tongued skinks. So there's actually quite a few subspecies of blue-tongued skinks. You can have northern and eastern ones from Australia, and they require a humidity of only 40 to 60%. Whereas you could get an Indonesian blue-tongued skink like Bruce here, who requires humidity to be 60 to 80%. So if he was too dry and kept like an Australian one, he could end up with skin issues, poor shedding. An Australian one kept at his humidity requirements could potentially run into respiratory issues. So even just blue-tongued skinks there, you need to know what subspecies you're keeping and what environment you need to mimic. Number 9, what a healthy reptile looks like. This may sound silly, but I think it's good to see a few good examples of healthy leopard geckos, bearded dragons, ball pythons, crested geckos, whatever you're researching, before buying one from a shop, a breeder, an expo. And once again, you can see these on a lot of Facebook groups, I will say, will call people out if they post like maybe an unhealthy bearded dragon with MBD. Someone will be like, hey, it looks like your beardy has MBD, this is how you might want to treat it. So sometimes on those groups, if you're in a decent group, you will see people's healthy animals, and you'll also see people call out when there's a sickly animal. And finally, number 10, go big. So what I mean by this is when you're researching your animal, you're going to see care guides that suggest the minimum size tank an animal needs. Don't feel like you have to stick to that. In all honesty, if you go bigger, it's probably better. As long as the enclosure is set out correctly for the species you're keeping, that animal will likely use all of the space you're providing. So, of course, there's going to be some instances where you can only provide the minimum for now. Hopefully, there's an ambition there to expand in the future. I will say if a care guide suggests a 10-gallon tank, we're going to ignore that because no animal needs to be in a 10-gallon tank. For me, I had my leopard geckos in 2-foot tanks for the longest time, but then I upgraded to 3-foot tanks and I've never looked back. And honestly, if I gave them even more room, they'd probably use it too. So if you can go big, go for it. So I hope this video has helped. Let me know in the comments below, what reptile are you currently researching? I'm very curious. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. But thank you for watching and goodbye.